This presentation is called Language and Reading: What, Why, and How in 20 minutes. Cindy asked me to give this presentation in order to help to be a precursor to the phonological awareness presentation, and the idea was to sort of talk about language and how language is connected to reading development. This is sort of the hits and the highlights, what is important in terms of language development for children in school and how it connects to their language, to their reading success. So the first thing I wanted to add was what is language? Language is a blanket term that speech pathologists use to cover a whole range of skills, but generally we're talking about oral verbal communication skills, listening and speaking kind of stuff. So it includes things like their vocabulary, includes things like how they put sentences together. It talks about how they understand and can use concepts for spatial relationships, quantity concepts, time and sequence, like before and after. It talks about narrative understanding, so how they understand stories, that a story has a beginning, has a middle, has an end, there's a problem and a solution, those kind of things. It talks about how kids are able to compare and contrast ideas, the idea that something is connected to something else. And actually comparing and contrasting is a fairly key skill because it comes into a lot of our outcomes, connecting old knowledge to new knowledge, connecting that kind of stuff. So that's comparing and contrasting. Talking about social language skills. So things like how kids are able to understand each other, how they are able to recognize things like sarcasm, that kind of stuff, and their listening skills, auditory processing and listening skills. There's lots and lots of other things that language can be, but this is sort of some of the key features of language. So in terms of how language and literacy are connected, we know that there are building blocks to literacy success. The basics that we know of, the three main ones, are alphabet knowledge, which is recognizing the print characters that represent sounds. In English, we are a sound-based system, but the idea that kids can recognize the letters and have some knowledge of what those letters, what sounds they represent. Then there's phonological awareness, and that's the ability of the students to perceive and manipulate sounds and the sound structure of words. So the beginning sound in a word, the end sound in a word, things that rhyme, how many syllables in a word, all that is connected to phonological awareness. And then there's the oral language, that we just discussed. And what we know about the connection between language and literacy is that kids that come to school with good phonological awareness skills tend to have success in early grades. That's a good predictor of how they're going to do in their early reading, grade 1, grade 2. Oral language skills, though, is going to be a stronger predictor of later success with literacy past grade 3. So, and particularly within that oral language, it is the vocabulary. So we know that kids that have good language skills ultimately are going to be our best readers. So language really is a key component of becoming a successful student. In fact, there is research that suggests that the strongest predictor of school success throughout school is their language skills, and we can look at that as early as kindergarten. And I guess the other thing to know is that we have to recognize the contribution of language in terms of how we teach, oral language in terms of how we teach and how we evaluate. We use those skills all the time in terms of our teaching and in terms of our evaluation of students. All right, so what are we going to do? Language skills are really important. How can we build those oral, verbal, speaking and listening skills with students? And the things that we know can help is having conversations with students. It is something that is sometimes feels like an add-on, but it really does help the kids improve their language skills to have conversations with adults that can scaffold and build their language. Strive for 5. Basically that means in terms of a conversation we're trying to have 5 turns. So back and forth 5 times. So each participant is probably going to have 2 or 3 parts in the exchange. Trying to use questions and comments that promote dialogue. So why? How come? What do you think about? What would happen? trying to avoid questions that test, especially if you know or suspect that this child already knows the answers. So what is it? What color? What shape? What size? If we do want to find out if a child has those skills, has that knowledge, then absolutely those are good questions. But if we're trying to develop our language, the language of our students, we want to try and ask bigger, broader, more involved questions so that we can have a back and forth. A question like what color is it tends to have an answer, and then that conversation is done. And we know that the biggest challenge to having good conversations with kids is the number of students that we're dealing with. So if we have opportunities to split our classes into smaller groups, try and take those opportunities so that we can give kids an opportunity to have conversations in smaller groups. And this is where you can look creatively at what supports you have in your building that can help you out. Things like your RTI teacher. Is your RTI teacher coming into the classroom? Is that a way to build smaller groups so we can have some conversations? Is your LST teacher coming into your classroom? Is the speech pathologist coming into your classroom? Use those opportunities to build in small group interaction opportunities. So once we know that we have small groups and we want to try and use our small groups and our conversations to build language skills with kids, what do we want to focus on? And one of the very, very fundamental skills would be working with vocabulary. We want to try and build vocabulary skills to improve their success with reading, particularly beyond grade 2. When we're doing that, we want to be attentive to the vocabulary that we're using. We want to try and think about the vocabulary and really think about, are these vocabulary terms that the kids really do understand? And it is surprising sometimes that kids don't have a good understanding of the vocabulary skills that we think they probably should have. If we're questioning it, probe a little bit. Find out, do they have a good understanding of all the vocabulary that's being used. We want to try and encourage both early vocabulary, so step 1, basic vocabulary skills like long, like door, very, very basic labels for things. And we also want to think about including more sophisticated vocabulary, because again, that's the vocabulary that they're going to start seeing when they're reading more complex text. So we want to look at step 2 and step 3 vocabulary as well. Step 2 vocabulary is 2 kinds of things. So they're more sophisticated, so something like having purchase instead of buy, and also using more precise words. So using exhausted as a more explicit word for a word like tired. Step 3 vocabulary, those are specialized words that refer to specific disciplines or areas of expertise. So we want to try and include those step 2 and step 3 vocabulary as well as those step 1 words. And that's where you can kind of target a broad range of students, because we know that some kids are going to need that early step 1 vocabulary. They don't have the very basics. Other kids really are ready for the vocabulary enrichment even as early as pre-K and K. So we can use those opportunities to build vocabularies. We want to encourage broad and deep vocabulary understanding of existing and new words. So when I talk about broad and deep, we want to just not only be able to recognize the word or say that we know the word, but do we know a word that means the same thing? Do we know a word that means the opposite? Can we talk about what that word means? Can we tell somebody? Can we give examples? Broad and deep, bigger vocabulary base. In terms of how do we teach vocabulary, STARS is a quick little acronym that we can use, and it basically means if you know you're introducing a new word, we want to stress the new word. We want to show what it means, so using visuals of some description. It might be a gesture, it might be a picture, all kinds of different ways of showing it. Tell what it means, and again, this is very specific. We want, exhausted, that means tired, being very specific about that. We want to relate the word to personal knowledge. So after you've played 3 hockey games in a row, you might be more than tired, you might be exhausted. And then we want to say it again. So we want to give, as with most things, new words aren't acquired immediately. We need to give them more opportunity to hear them again and again. The next thing that we would want to think about in terms of building vocabulary, building language skills with kids rather, would be to consider the concepts. And that's a kind of a subgroup of vocabulary skills that basically refers to how things are connected to each other. So longer, shorter, brighter, darker, all those kind of describing kinds of words. And one of the areas that we particularly notice that concepts come into play would be in math. And about 3 or 4 years ago, the speech pathologists noticed that there was a really big increase in referrals with kids that were a little bit later on in their school years. And we also noticed that there was a lot of description of kids getting referred to us, kids that previously had done very well in math and were now having many more struggles in math. And the reason that we came up with was the fact that in math, all of a sudden there was a lot more of a language base. And so concepts really became a much bigger focus because the kids needed to not only be able to manipulate the numbers, but they needed to be able to understand the language that was connected with it. So thinking about things like as many. If you're asking a student, can you give me as many blocks as coins, then they need to know what as many means. They need to know equal. They need to know more and less. And those concepts come into even kindergarten math, and we need to know that the kids have those concepts. So before we can say they're having difficulty with the math, numeracy awareness, we need to know that they have the language skills to demonstrate their abilities. The next area that I wanted to point out was just grammar and sentence structure. So are they putting their sentences together in an age-appropriate way? Are they using mature or mostly mature sentence structure? And really we are expecting kids coming into kindergarten to have mostly mature sentence structure. Where it comes into reading development particularly is that as kids are learning to read, we know that they use their grammar and their sentence structure when they're predicting what the word is that they should be reading. They use a lot of anticipating of words when they're early readers. So if they don't have mature sentence structure and grammar when they're speaking, they're not going to be able to use that mature sentence structure and grammar when they're reading. So if you have a child that comes in is still saying him and her instead of he and she, and they go to read a word like he and she, they might predict that that word is going to be him and her, and it's never going to match for them. So grammar can be important for kids in that respect. A lot of kids need to be specifically taught their grammar skills. It needs to be specifically pointed out to them that their grammar that they've used isn't the correct grammar, because really, why do we say he and she instead of him and her? We just do. It refers to the same thing, but we use he and she to start a sentence. We use him and her later on in the sentence. In pre-K, K, and grade 1, we want to focus on regular rules in terms of grammar. So if you have one cat, you have a cat. If you have two, you have two cats. We add an S on the end of that. That's a regular rule. Making it go from 1 to more than 1, we add S. If we want to talk about grade 2 and above, we want to start talking about irregular forms, so that when we have one mouse, we have two mice. It doesn't follow a rule. It's something that we need to learn. So early on, saying mouses is perfectly acceptable. Once we're asked about grade 2, we want to start thinking about teaching those irregular forms. As I said before, sometimes we have to be very explicit when we're talking with kids in terms of their grammar. We say she if we mean it's a girl, and we don't say her when we start a sentence. Some kids need a very, very specific direction along that line. And a lot of great things can happen if we're doing incidental modeling and correction. If the child comes to you and says her is going to the store, you can say, oh, she is going to the store. I wonder what she will buy. Put a little emphasis on there. Make sure that they're hearing the difference. They don't necessarily need to repeat it after you. They just need to have heard it. So where to go with it now? There's a couple of good resources out there. One is called ABC and Beyond, Learning Language and Loving It is another one. And they're both programs that a few of us have been able to offer, but the guidebooks are quite easy to read. They're fairly straightforward, and there's some good ideas in terms of how to develop language within classrooms and how language is connected to reading. Your school SLP is also a great resource for you. And really, with a lot of these skills that we are talking about, if we find that kids don't really have them, the SLP is a great person to ask. If they're not already on program with us, maybe they should be, or maybe there's a way for us to help you out at a classroom level.